Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. In the first hour, we're going to talk about what is happening in Israel and, of course, the Iranian treaty. And we have in studio with us Avi Lipkin. He has been with us so many different times. As a matter of fact, we might reminisce for just a minute how long that's been. You are familiar with him, perhaps, with some of the other books we've talked about here on Point of View. Is Fanatic Islam a Global Threat? Christian Revival for Israel's Survival, as well as some of the more recent books, Islam Prophesied in Genesis, and this new book that I have right in my hands. We'll hold it up here for those of you watching online. Islamic Rivalry, ISIS and Iran are fighting for the heart of Islamic identity. And we've talked about the differences between Sunni and Shiite, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But Avi, as always, great to have you in studio with us.
And great to be in Dallas with you.
Yeah. I was just thinking about this the other day when we were talking to you by phone from Jerusalem, that we go all the way back to 1990, when you first were on here. That's 25 years of having you in this studio, either with Marlon Maddox or Penna Dexter or myself, and we've really appreciated the relationship over the years.
Me too. Actually, this is the very first radio show that I did in November, I think it was, of 1990. It was a KVTT Christian radio fundraiser, and a lady from San Antonio said, you're going to be on Marlon Maddox. And we all thought Marlon Maddox was God, so I said to her, how can I be on that show? I'm nobody. And you're going to be, Lord told me you're going to be on that show. So we drove to the fundraiser in Dallas, got lost, almost got mugged in some place in Dallas, got late to the dinner. And then the crowd just opened up. Marlon was right there by himself. And Nancy says to me, go get him. The Lord's telling you to get him. And Marlon said, you'll be on my show tomorrow.
That's great.
Just like that.
And, of course, you've been on with us on a regular basis. Yeah. And we've seen you produce a lot of these books. And we last time we were with you, I want to give a quick update to that. You've been developing a Judeo-Christian party in the Knesset. I mean, after all, Arabs can serve in the Knesset. Of course, Jews obviously serve in the Knesset. But where's the place for any kind of Christians? So talk about that.
Yes. Well, indeed. The Christian population of Israel has grown incredibly since the Russian immigration to Israel in 1989, 1990. At first, we had only 2% of our population, which was Arab Christian. Today, it's 2% Arab Christian, 6% Russian Christian immigrants married to Jews. And I predict, in addition to that 8%, we will be having very soon many, many American Jews and Christian spouses moving to Israel. The population of Israel today is 6.5 million Jews and Christians. Tomorrow it will be 16 million. ISIS has promised to carry out a Holocaust on American soil in conjunction with 9/11 attacks, kill the Jews, kill their Christian spouses and children. So I predict a tsunami of Jewish and Christian immigration to Israel. And if I am correct, and if I'm still alive, I'll be actually creating and leading the biggest party in the Israeli political system in a few years. So.
Well, it's, again, some things that we've been talking about with him. Again, many people remember you from the author subtitle Victor Mordecai. So if you see a book by Victor Mordecai, it's also Dennis Avi Lipkin, and we have him in studio with us today. I want to get into your book, Islamic Rivalry, but we have, over the last day or two, been talking about the treaty or the agreement with Iran. There are lots of questions that we've raised, but I'd love to get your take, because as a person who lives in Israel, you are even more sensitive to the possibility of what Iran might do towards the nation of Israel.
Well, yes. In Israel, we're kind of like baffled. We can't understand how President Obama could do such a thing unless he had some ulterior motive to do it. And I believe he does have two ulterior motives. Ulterior motive number one, Iran is teetering on the brink economically. The people are suffering. The Iranian people are a great people. And historically, our friendship of the Jews and the Iranians goes back thousands of years. And I see the Ayatollah regime as an anomaly. And I think what we're all working for, including President Obama, is a regime change. He says he isn't doing that, but in other words, he's not committing American troops to an attack on Iran. But the bottom line is overthrow the regime, bring about a new regime backed by the UN, a regime which will be pro-Saudi, not an enemy of Saudi. This is one of the commands President Obama has from the King of Saudi Arabia to fulfill. Another thing also very important, U.S. Got involved in very, very painful, costly wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And President Obama, I'm not defending him, mind you, but what I'm saying is his idea was, as naive as it was and as disastrous as it was, pull the American troops out, bring them home, then everything collapses in Iraq and you get ISIS. So now he doesn't want to send American troops back to fight ISIS. What he wants is Iran to do it.
Yes.
Iran can do it, but Iran is facing bankruptcy. Now, this agreement, which has just been approved in Europe, not confirmed by Congress yet, but approved by Europe, will give Iran $150 billion, which is much needed by the Iranian government to try somehow to placate the Iranian people, ameliorate the horrible situation of the civilian population in Iran, because as it is, I believe, there is tremendous opposition today in Iran to sending any more Iranian boys to go get killed fighting ISIS. So basically what Obama is doing is sound in the sense that support Iran, give them money so they continue fighting the battle that America doesn't want to fight.
Yeah. And that kind of relates to your book, exactly, because the subtitle is ISIS in Iran. Let's recognize that ISIS is a Sunni Muslim sect. Iran, of course, is Shiite. Shiite tend to be mostly in the southern part of Iraq and, of course, in Iran. And so there has been a division between Islam, really, since almost the fourth caliph, right?
Yes, the fourth caliph was Ali. And he, shall I say, his children and grandchildren and those following him, the bloodline of Prophet Muhammad, decided to terminate the followers of the first three caliphs, and that's how the fighting started. The struggle between the Shiites and the Sunnis has absolutely nothing to do with religion, with Islam itself. It is a war over turf. Who is going to control the wealth? Who's going to control the territories? Who's going to control the power? And this has been going on for 1,400 years. It's kind of like the Catholic Protestant wars of Reformation of 300 years, but a million times worse. And I don't know if there are people who might be offended by what I'm saying, but praise God, Catholics and Protestants are not killing each other anymore. I think they're kind of friendly with each other. I know people don't like that. But in Islam, there is really no mechanism for forgiveness and for ending this 1,400-year struggle between Shiites and Sunnis. Now, because the Sunnis are 85% of the Islamic world, I predict the Sunnis, with the backing of the U.S., Europe, and the Vatican, will terminate the Shiites. The Shiite Islam will be either terminated or neutered, and Sunni Islam will be preeminent.
Yeah. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to spend some time talking with Avi Lipkin. And if you would like to join the conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. His new book, Islamic Rivalry. ISIS and Iran are fighting for the heart of Islamic identity. And the sort of the big dog right now in the middle of the Middle East is Iran. But at the same time, as Avi has pointed out, they are bankrupt. And this particular treaty will remove those sanctions and as a result, perhaps provide them with impetus to continue to fight against ISIS. But at the same time, what about these proxy wars and so many other issues that we are talking about as well? And of course, we have an individual here who lives in Israel and will certainly be speaking to what this means to the nation of Israel. So we have lots to talk about today. 1-800-351-1212. At any point, you're welcome to join our conversation. We'll be back with Avi Lipkin right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
Immigration is in the news these days, but not for the typical reasons. Usually we're discussing immigration reform because a bill has been filed or the Gang of Eight has decided to push legislation forward. Immigration is in the news these days for three very different reasons. Ann Coulter has a new book out with a provocative title, Adios, America. And speaking of provocative, we certainly have heard lots of comments about Donald Trump's statements in his campaign kickoff speech. And add to this the murder of Kate Steinle in the sanctuary city of San Francisco, and you have lots of people talking about immigration. Many of the facts and statistics are startling. Most Americans have a high school diploma. By contrast, about 75% of illegal aliens do not have a high school diploma. It's safe to say that many of the Mexicans coming to America are not achievers in the educational or economic sense. Of greater concern is the number of illegal aliens in prison. And Coulter reminds us that the federal government refuses to tell us how many prisoners are immigrants. What we do know is concerning. For example, there are more foreign inmates in the New York State prisons from Mexico than from the entire continent of Europe. This is significant since half of all Mexican immigrants in the United States live either in Texas or California. One estimate is that 71% of non-American citizens in federal prisons are from Mexico. Another government statistic shows that Mexican criminals represent 16% of all convicts serving time in federal penitentiaries. You know, President Reagan signed the Immigration Reform Act in 1986. President Bill Clinton signed another immigration reform bill in 1996. Nearly 20 years later, we still have a problem, in part because the mayor of San Francisco and the Obama administration will not obey the immigration laws on the books. We need this debate if for no other reason than the fact that important facts are starting to surface about our immigration chaos. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Might as well open up the phones because calls are already coming in. And Avi Lipkin with us in studio. His latest book, Islamic Rivalry, ISIS and Iran are fighting for the heart of Islamic identity. But before we get back to the book, let me mention that one of your earlier books, Israel's Bible Bloc. Well, that's that Judeo-Christian party, if you will, that you've been talking about. And you will be establishing that very soon. And then I know you're going to be coming back to the States to really make sure that you have the financial funding for that. And you're going to run for the Knesset too, isn't that true?
Yes, the Knesset, by the way, the word Knesset is the same as ekklesia in Greek, which means church.
Uh-huh.
So Knesset is like a gathering of 120 deputies. In Israel, we don't run as individuals per district. We run per list.
Right.
And you need about 140,000 votes for the first three candidates, 140,000. The Christians in Israel today total 440,000. So I think we have a fairly good shot. 300,000 Jews are married to Christians. So theoretically, my constituency potentially is 15% of the vote, which is 15 members of Knesset. And if we all get in, all the people on my list, then that would mean we would even be part of Netanyahu's next, I hope it's Netanyahu's next coalition.
Yes, well, so again, a lot of things happening. And I might mention that another book you have coming out is about your wife. And I've met Rachel once, but I guess you're going to bring her back next time because she has been able to really monitor what the Muslims are saying.
Correct.
And I've said this before. Matter of fact, I said it in my Sunday school class. Got a member from my class here today. As a matter of fact, they say one thing to the public and say something else to each other. And so because she's so fluent in Arabic, she's been able to find out all sorts of things that they're saying to one another that never get reported in our mainstream media, right?
Very correct. And in fact, I think one of the most important things is that 30 years ago, when she first started working the radio, she picked up a broadcast by the Saudis. And they were saying, even if it takes us 150 years, we are going to make America a Muslim country. And my wife thought they were delusional. How can you make the greatest Christian country on earth, praise God, a Muslim country? Now she picks up the same station saying, we thought we would make America Muslim in 150 years. We were wrong. It's only going to take us 30 years to make America Muslim. And they said in 2006, we will have a Muslim president in the White House in 2008. And my wife thought they were delusional. All this was in Arabic.
Yeah.
And nobody knew who Obama was then. And he's president, and he's a Muslim.
Yeah, well, that's what they think anyway, right?
Yeah.
You know, they say to each other that. So it's kind of interesting to begin to hear some of those things behind the scenes. And because of your wife's work in all those years and finding out what is actually being said, we've been able to find that out. And another good reason to buy your books, because you put a lot of that in your books. And a lot of times people will say, where did you hear that? Where did you read that? Well, lots of times we read them in your books.
Right.
Let's talk about this idea of this Islamic revival. There's a real power play right now. Who's going to be the dominant force? And if Iran had the money, they are the dominant force, true?
Not necessarily. The way I see it, Sunni Islam is the dominant force. They are 85%. Saudi Arabia, at least until now, is really the powerhouse. You have other contenders like Qatar, Turkey. But the Iranians now need the $150 billion from this agreement that President Obama and the Europeans have approved because their economy is faltering.
Right.
They have massive unemployment. They are not. The sanctions have hurt Iran very much, and I think the decision by the Europeans and by the United States, by President Obama, to give them the $150 billion is to try to ameliorate the economic situation of the Iranian people, so that they will be a little easier with the leadership in Iran to continue sending their boys to get killed in battle against the Sunnis.
Wow.
Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is Shiite. They now are facing a problem of mass desertions. The Shiites fighting in Syria are now running home back to Lebanon. There's a very big problem. And the Sunni volunteers of ISIS outnumber the volunteers of the Shiites by a lot.
That's amazing.
So they're going to lose. Iran's going to lose. I think basically by giving them $150 billion, the West is saying, we'll give you some more rope to hang yourself.
Now, ISIS has certainly been able to occupy a lot more territory, as much as almost Great Britain. Has all sorts of financial resources from oil and human trafficking and all the rest. What kind of influence are they having in the Middle East?
Well, Iran, of course, is the greatest international sponsor of terrorism in the world. Iran has its tentacles, like you said, in Iraq, in the Shiite part of Iraq. Saddam Hussein slaughtered the Shiites of Iraq for decades. Iran now is basically mobilizing them to defend themselves from the Sunnis.
Yeah, from the ISIS. Yeah.
And ISIS basically is comprised of former Saddam Hussein officers who were fired by the Shiite leadership. So it's very tribal, very ethnic. And these people, the Sunnis, are basically forming an army to conquer the entire Middle East, which includes, of course, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. And last thing I want to say before I hand the microphone back to you, Al Jazeera, which everyone has heard of, came out with a poll, 30,000 respondents, 82% support ISIS. 92% in Saudi Arabia support ISIS.
Amazing.
So ISIS is not an aberration. ISIS is Islam.
Yeah, and again, we've always been told that really some of the other countries want ISIS to be destroyed, and here you're saying that just the opposite. At least out on the street, a lot of people are actually supporting the ideas of ISIS.
Very correct, because they are pure, pristine, Orthodox Islam.
Wow. Let's take some phone calls along the way. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll head out to California first, KYCC. Chris, thank you for calling today. You're on with Avi Lipkin.
Hi, how you guys doing today?
Very good.
my question is, you hear the media talk about, it's always got to be a radical Islam. Where's the non-radical ones speaking out against it in this country about what's going on? If there was Christians or so-called Christians in another country murdering people in the name of Jesus, the churches here would be, would put on a show and demonstrate, hey, that's not us, that's not us. But here, they're all silent, which tells me, I don't care if they're Sunni or Shiite. To me, in my eyes, they look all the same.
I agree 100%, sir. Very good point. I'll add another thing also. I say there is indeed moderate Islam, just as there is moderate Nazism. Mm-hmm. So there is no such thing as moderate Islam. Now, there are good Muslims. According to the FBI, CIA, RCMP in Canada, 90% of the Muslims in Canada and the U.S. are peacekeeping, law-abiding citizens. Only, quote unquote, only 10% are terrorists. So I don't know how many millions or how many tens of millions of Muslims you have in the U.S., but only 10% are terrorists. 19 guys shut down the U.S. on 9/11. We're talking about at least 1 or 2 million terrorists floating around this country right now.
And again, 10% here, but when you go over to the Middle East, it's not a 10% radical. It's a lot higher percentage, isn't it?
And if the moderates, this gentleman is correct, if you're a Muslim and you consider yourself a moderate and you protest the fanatics, they just kill you because you're an infidel and a heretic. Yeah. If you go against the mainline fanatic system.
And, to be fair, there have been a few people that have over the years spoken out against this. But again, there are usually death threats against those individuals. They pay a very heavy price. And if you've come from an experience just 15 miles from where we are right now, Pamela Geller almost got killed by two individuals that were influenced by ISIS. So there's a price to pay when sometimes you speak out and are perceived as somebody who has offended Muhammad or offended Islam. True?
Very, very correct. I'll say another thing also, and it's something that the agenda in America doesn't like to talk about. The media doesn't talk about it. Do you remember the Boston bombers, the Tsarnaev brothers?
Sure do.
And, Russia warned America because Russia knew who they were. And because you have so many Muslims in American homeland defense, security, the thing was poo-pooed. There were 3 Jewish college boys who were found with their slits throat, and the Boston police couldn't figure it out. And there was heroin all over their bodies. Mm-hmm. But their wallets were not taken. Mm-hmm. Their money was not taken. So that's already suspicious there. After the Boston Marathon bombing, the police, during their interrogations of the entire group, found out that the Tsarnaev brothers slit the throats of those 3 Jewish kids. Slitting the throats of Jewish people and Christians is okay. It's cool in Islam.
That's amazing. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about Avi Lipkin, and he is in the country right now, and we'll be speaking a number of venues even after we finish this interview. And, of course, next time he's here, you might want to schedule him for something as well. So we do want to talk about some of the resources available on his website, including his books. But the one we're talking about today, Islamic Rivalry. ISIS and Iran are fighting for the heart of Islamic identity. It is his latest book, and I would certainly commend to you some of the others that he has written as well. We have information about him on our website, pointofview.net, as well as some of our take action items, and most importantly, suggesting to some of you maybe that have been listening for some time, perhaps you could consider what you might do to give even a gift of $5 to help us continue bringing these broadcasts to you. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll take some more phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back with Avi Lipkin right after this.
What does a hero look like? I remember a woman stricken with MS. She was in a wheelchair, and every week after church, people would get down on a knee and greet her and pray for her. But do you know what caught my eye? The seemingly invisible man behind the wheelchair, silently caring for his beloved, sacrificing for her. In the Bible, Jesus talked about a big giver who had a marching band come with him as he dumped his treasure in the temple coffers. But Jesus saw a woman who gave a tiny gift that was actually huge. If you appreciate Point of View but can't give $30 or $65 or more, well, get this. If every listener gave $5, it would pay our bills for the next 3 years. 3 years. Give $5 today. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Thank you for being our hero. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
In studio with us today, Avi Lipkin. If you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Because he's in studio, you can also watch the program as well as listen to it. And I want to talk about Mecca and Medina in just a minute, because your earlier book, Return to Mecca, as well as this book, Islamic Rivalry, has a whole chapter on it. But let's take a phone call that relates to one of the other conversations that we've just had. Dave in Missouri, listening on KCMH. Dave, you're on with Avi Lipkin.
Well, thanks for taking my call. I just wanted to ask, how do you know there are good Muslims in the U.S. and Canada, since it is permissible to lie to the infidels? They even have a name for it, lying to the infidels.
Yes, it's called taqiyya. Very good point. The point, when I don't say good, I say peacekeeping, law-abiding Muslims. Now, there are two types of Islamic agenda. There's the revolutionary, which is terrorism. That's the 10%. And then there's evolutionary, which is peaceful, taking America over by peaceful means. Now, I would say most Muslims don't really care in America if America becomes Muslim. Maybe they came here to get away from it. But the Islamic agenda, especially of Saudi Arabia, is that America will be taken over by financial means and by immigration. And there are charter jets flying into the United States every day carrying in illegal Muslims from all over the world with no passports or visas, and they're processed here because the gatekeepers are bribed and the floodgates are wide open. So this country is being invaded by millions of Muslims. This whole thing with 12 million illegal Mexicans is just a charade. The real problem is the 50 to 100 million Muslims that, according to my understanding, are being programmed to be brought here. And that's one of the reasons why the U.S. government supports the Muslim Brotherhood, to bring about the collapse of the economies of all these Middle Eastern countries, bring them in here. And again, I didn't say that they were good. I'm saying that they are peaceful, law-abiding people, because eventually Sharia law will be brought here and American law will be replaced.
Let's, if we can, just before I take another phone call, get into the issue of Mecca, because this is an interesting set of circumstances. You have, on the one hand, ISIS that wants to destroy the Kaaba in Mecca. Of course, you have the Saudi kingdom, as well as various Sunnis that are certainly overseeing that. But then you also talk about return to Mecca, because some of them have said that Jews want to take over Mecca, which I don't see in my Bible. So explain that, if you might. Put that all together, if you can.
Well, actually, Jim and Penny Caldwell, very dear friends of mine who lived in Arabia, gave me a quote from one of Osama bin Laden's speeches. And Osama bin Laden basically was saying, we have to destroy Israel and destroy the Jews, because if we don't, they're going to come back to Arabia and reclaim it, and they're going to take Mecca and Medina, which they claim is theirs.
Wow.
And one of the things Jim and Penny Caldwell said, that the real Mount Sinai is not in Santa Catarina, the Egyptian peninsula, but in northwest Saudi, basically about 40-day hike from Eilat or from Beersheba. And if you look at 1 Kings chapter 19, and Elijah the prophet, the angel of the Lord says to him, you have 40 days and 40 nights till you reach Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb. So I think we all know really where it is. The Saudi army has fenced off Mount Sinai. Anyone who goes through the fence can be shot or arrested. They were actually arrested for going across the fence. Mm-hmm. And they proved that this is really where the real Mount Sinai is. You ask the Bedouin, they say that's Jebel Musa, that's the mountain of Moses. So we have a history. The city of Medina, the two holy cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina. One of the names of Medina in Arabic is Yathrib. Yathrib in Arabic is Jethro.
Jethro. And that's a biblical name.
Well, yeah. Jethro, Moses, and Aaron were there. And my contention, which makes a lot of rabbis unhappy, is that the phylacteries that I put on every day, the phylacteries on the forehead and on the arm, the black cube and the straps, that black cube, I believe, is a replica of the black stone in Mecca, because Moses and Aaron and Jethro were there. And in Exodus 13, we're still in our pagan homes in Egypt, slaves in Egypt, Exodus 13, we're about to leave, and we put these things on our foreheads like gyroscopes to take us out of the pyramid structure of Pharaoh, the triangle, take us to the cube structure of Arabia, freedom in the desert. And Moses actually says to Pharaoh, the first time he says, let my people go, it says in Hebrew that they may go around in circles in the desert. And now that's not the King James translation, that's the Avi Lipkin translation. But it is Hebrew, that you go around. Hajj means pilgrim who goes around 7 times.
Yeah.
And in Hebrew, Hajj means a holiday, but it's the same word.
Yeah. That is just amazing. Some people might say, why would ISIS want to destroy Mecca? Because after all, that's supposed to be the holiest site of Islam. Why is it that ISIS wants to destroy the Kaaba in Mecca?
ISIS is destroying all of the pre-Islamic pagan sites. The Black Stone, the Kaaba, was a pre-Islamic pagan site. And they say, ISIS says, that the prophet, so-called, the prophet Muhammad, had no right to incorporate that pagan black stone into pure, pristine Islam.
That is just amazing. It's really hard to tell the players without the scorecard. So, again,
Right.
That's one of the reasons why they might want to get your book. Let's, if we can, go to another caller in California. Is it Ho-Ho? Is that how you pronounce your name?
Hey, this is Jojo. How you going?
Oh, Jojo. Okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hey, I had a question for Avi. I heard an interview with the King of Jordan, and he mentioned that the goal of ISIS is to create a united Arabic state, like the United States of Arabia, and then afterwards, their mission would be to attack Israel and try to defeat Israel. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, indeed, there are great fears that ISIS will now move into Jordan, take over Jordan, kill the king, kill the royal family. There is, like I said earlier, 82% of the people of Jordan support ISIS. They're going to take Saudi Arabia. 92% of the Saudis support ISIS. They're going to blow up the Kaaba. They're going to kill the king of Saudi Arabia and the entire royal family. And they're going to blow up the oil wells to deny the Christian West, the world economy, the oxygen, the petroleum that it needs to survive. I think at that stage, something we all know is the one world government is going to intervene and basically ban Islam, because it's like, as long as they provide the oil and provide the cash back to the Western economies, they can be tolerated as crazy as they are.
He mentioned something else, and that is this idea of a united Arab state. There was a time under the Ottoman Empire where you had this idea of a caliphate, kind of a transnational structure. It seems that both the Muslim Brotherhood, that's why it was established, as well as ISIS want to establish that. Talk about what that looks like and what that actually means.
Well, what they want is something impossible. What they want is to go back to the 7th, 8th centuries, 9th centuries, when indeed you had like a king, a sultan, and he would rule over, or a caliph, and he would rule over all these people. And what happened eventually over the centuries was, because there was no democracy and there was no, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So these caliphates basically degenerated. And then eventually they were taken over by, like the Turks, for example, who were a tribe of horsemen coming in from the mid-Asia. I'm a firm believer in Judeo-Christian Western civilization and democracy. There are those checks and balances, at least there were until now, where theoretically, the corruption stops. Or if there is corruption by the Democrats, the Republicans come in. If there's corruption by the Republicans, the Democrats come in. So you have this pendulum swinging back and forth. In Islam, if you don't have that pendulum, which they say will never happen, they say over our dead bodies, that democracy is a Christian, Western idea. It's not an Islamic idea. So it's like they're going to continue making the same mistakes they've been making from the 7th century. It's not going to succeed in any way.
Yeah, just incredible. What does this all mean for Israel? We've kind of come back to this idea that you, of course, want to run for the Knesset, and, of course, you've been very much involved in Israeli politics, but Benjamin Netanyahu has been warning America of what it would be like to have a nuclear Islam and a nuclear Iran, and to have various Islamic states have weapons. Pakistan sort of does already, so that's already a foregone conclusion. But what does a nuclear Iran look like, and how does that affect Israel?
Okay, well, firstly, I have to tell your listeners that in my third book, which came out in 2003, Islamic Threat Updates Almanac number 1, there was an article that I received from Ronen Bergman. Ronen Bergman is a very well-known intelligence reporter in Israel, in the newspaper Yediot Achronot, which is the biggest newspaper in Israel. And I received permission to translate the article and reprint it in my third book. And it also appears in this new book, Islamic Rivalry, that Saudi Arabia has a missile base in the heart of Saudi Arabia, the Al Salail Oasis, a Chinese-built and maintained missile base. The Chinese, over the last 30 years, have sold over 120 Dongfeng missiles. They're like Pershings. And Abdul Qadir Khan, the Pakistani father of the nuclear bomb of Pakistan, the funding came from Saudi. So payback is they give the Saudis nuclear tips. So the nuclear tips are now on Chinese missiles.
Wow.
So Saudi Arabia has been a nuclear missile power for the last 30 years. So the Iranians, of course, under American and Israeli help, before the fall of the Shah, began their own nuclear program. So this is not anything new.
Yeah.
So what Iran, if I were an Iranian, I'd say, hey, the Saudis have these nuclear missiles. Why shouldn't we? So the Iranians are right from their perspective. The problem is the Saudis are semi-rational. Iranian leadership is not rational.
Yeah, we'll take a break and we'll come back to that because, you know, we survived the Cold War by this idea of deterrence, but does that work with an Islamic mindset? We'll talk about that with Avi Lipkin, but if you'd like to join us, we'll also give you a chance real quickly to ask a question and make a call, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
One of the things we talked about just a minute ago is how, during the Cold War, mutually assured destruction worked because it was deterrence. But if I can, for just a minute, Avi, get you to speak to that issue, because the Israeli mindset is certainly one that we need to protect ourselves from Iran. But at the same time, we don't believe that Iran is making calculuses and calculations the way Russians did. True?
Very correct. And another thing, the Ayatollah leadership in Iran has actually come out and said, our population in Iran is 70 million. Even if we lose half our population, Allah still wins.
Yes.
That's it's insanity.
That's insanity.
And so Israel is obviously very concerned because, We Jews, like you Christians, cherish life. God, the God of Israel, the God of the Jews and Christians, cherishes life. God does not seek our death. God seeks our life. And if we're sinners, which we all are, then our repentance. But he wants us to live. God is like a parent who cares for his children. In Islam, Allah is not the same God. Allah is another God who wants to kill his children. He wants to kill the Jews, kill the Christians, kill the Hindus, kill the Buddhists, kill the blacks in Africa, and then the Muslims slaughter each other in the name of Allah. And here you have the Shiites and the Sunnis slaughtering each other. So I think, and I got a 3-year jail sentence for saying it, Allah is Satan, and Islam is not a religion, but a criminal psychosis.
And I've said before on this program that one of the greatest threats to a Muslim is another Muslim.
Very correct.
And but again, when you come back to the Jews and Christians, they say oftentimes, at least the radicals say, we're going to kill the Saturday people and then the Sunday people, right?
Right.
You know, and again, when we sometimes say, well, there are people in our country say, why do we support the nation of Israel? Well, in some respects, the enemy of Islam, especially the radicals, is the little Satan, and we're the big Satan. So we have to understand how that connects up. So again, this idea of deterrence doesn't work, and there is, if anything, perhaps right now in the Muslim mindset, that when the United States makes all these concessions, it shows weakness to them, and rather than have respect, they have less respect. True?
Very, very correct. And I'll say another thing also. Chapter 1 of my book is called American Policy Fallacies. And the Muslims are very, very afraid to have good relations with America, because America seems to have this tendency to stab allies in the back.
Yes.
So you have, for example, the Shah of Iran. He was the cornerstone of the Cold War against the Soviet Union in the Middle East. He was America's best Muslim friend. And Jimmy Carter stabbed him in the back and brought him down. Then you had Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was actually the savior in the war with Iran. 1980, 1988, the Iraqis paid a terrible price to defend the West and defend the Arab world. And then the United States turned its back on Saddam Hussein. He was bankrupt. He invaded Kuwait. I mean, I'm talking now like a Saddam Hussein backer.
Yeah.
I'm not, obviously, but that's how the Iraqis think. But the purpose of my book is to show you how the Arabs think.
How they perceive it, yes.
And then Saddam Hussein was betrayed by the United States, in his opinion. And he, the Oklahoma City bombing was a Saddam Hussein attack. The first attack on the World Trade Center in February 93 was a Saddam Hussein attack. The shooting down of TW-800 was a Saddam Hussein attack. That's why George W. got rid of him in 2003, because there was a long-standing decision that Saddam Hussein was a nuisance and had to be gotten rid of. So the United States stabbed Saddam Hussein in the back, who is your ally and your savior. Israel feels is being thrown under the bus by the United States. So the Arabs say, you know what? It's better to be an enemy of the U.S. than an ally.
Yeah. Again, Chapter 1, American Policy Fallacies, and it's part of Islamic Rivalry. ISIS and Iran are fighting for the heart of Islamic identity. Let's mention your website for just a minute, because if you go to vicmore.com, which stands for Victor Mordecai, you have a way for people to get that book and some others, but there's a way in which people can schedule you to speak, to correspond with you, to get some of your other books, because we've mentioned Is Fanatic Islam a Global Threat? We mentioned the Islamic Threat Update. We've mentioned Israel's Bible Block. Of course, we mentioned the book Return to Mecca. If people say, I just really need to read a little bit more about this to understand it, they can go to your website and find some of those resources. But also, you're available to speak. I know from here you're going to be speaking in a church tonight, aren't you?
Every night. And I have 2 more weeks, and then I go home. And then hopefully in November, I will come back with my wife, Rachel, and she is retiring finally from the Israeli monitoring services at the radio. And we're going to come out with a book on her life about what it was like to be a Jewish woman in Egypt during the years of Nasser, how they were expelled from Egypt penniless, and the type of work that she does. Rachel's life is a very, very interesting topic. And so all of us are going to work together to get this book out. And Rachel will be here to sign books in November. So anyone who wants me is going to get Rachel too.
Well, and again, one of the things that she has done that's helped all of us is that she's been able to break the code, if you will. I've learned a lot more about the Muslim Brotherhood because of your wife, and I've learned a lot more about how the Arab world perceives us and how they perceive certainly Barack Obama and others. So a lot of that just simply comes from the work she's done over the years of translating that Arabic. Well, how can people support you and help you out? Because you were talking about developing a Bible block, a Christian party in Israel, and certainly we pray for the peace of Jerusalem. But just before we run out of time, any things that we can do for you?
Yes, well, the website, of course, vicmord, VICMORD.com. If you go to the bookstore, there is a button somewhere hidden there to make the donation for the party. But if it's a big donation, which I hope there are, the best thing is to make out a check to Advocate Caleb Myers. Write to me. I'll tell you how to do it, because then the money is basically tax-free as far as I'm concerned. Otherwise, I pay tax. I pay 50% taxes on every penny I get. Wow. So if the money goes straight to the lawyer, it goes to the foundation of the party and then to the operating budget of the party. And we're going to start campaigning, and we will support Netanyahu.
Yeah. Do you think Benjamin Netanyahu was going to be in power for a while? Because, again, we've watched that last election, and some people were predicting that it would be really close. It didn't turn out to be very close at all.
Well, if you look at the Knesset website and you look at the last 20 elections, you see every election, the power of the right-wing and religious parties is increasing by 1 or 2 notches every time. So Netanyahu this time had 61. It's the first time he had 61. It's a small majority out of 120, but they are all right-wing and religious.
Pretty good.
And I predict next elections it'll be maybe 62 or 63 out of 120. If my party, God willing, gets into the Knesset, it'll jump to 65, 67, because my party is a religious party of Jews and Christians.
Yes. Well, and I might also mention that we're going to take another trip with some of our Point of View listeners to Israel. We'll see if we can drop by and see your son, see you, and some others. But
what month?
It'll be next May, so it'll be a while from here. And maybe you'll be here, maybe you'll be there. But either way, I know where your son lives now, so I'll go say hi to him. But this is a better time, whether people go on our trip or some other. For a while there, people were not coming to Israel and supporting Israel because they were fearful of those Hamas rockets. But now seems to be, I think it was always safe, but I think it now seems even more safe for people to go and travel to that part of the world, don't you think?
It is always safe in Israel. Tourists never get harmed in these terrorist attacks or whatever. It's always Israelis, usually Israelis in uniform. And something very important I wanted to stress in the little time that we have here, I don't think that the big problem is Islam. I think the big problem is atheism. I think that the big problem is lack of faith. And one of the purposes of Lipkin Tours, which is my son's tourist company, is to go to places like Shiloh, like Beth El, like Joshua's altar in Nablus Shechem, and to show the veracity of the Bible based on science and archaeology. And that's what we do. And of course, we go to Jerusalem and Hebron, the Tomb of the Patriarchs, and we go to the Dead Sea and Sea of Galilee and Golan Heights. We go everywhere. We go where you want to go, but we also add in at least 2 or 3 days of intense Bible study to prove the veracity of the Bible, that these places really existed and that the kings of Israel existed, and this is not fairy tales and wild imagination.
Yeah. Well, you're singing my song. Those are the kind of things we like to do as well. Avi, we've appreciated a quarter of a century of relationship with you. Thank you for coming into the studio today, and I know you got to get on the road to go speak in Oklahoma tonight, so thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you. You know what do you call a pallbearer in Oklahoma? A karaoke.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll stay on the subject of Islam, but it'll be a different topic, but we'll get to that. And we'll take, again, some of your phone calls. All that coming up right after this.
If you've been a Christian for any length of time, no doubt you've heard about Jesus feeding thousands with a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. Jesus took something small and turned it into something big. Recently, someone here at Point of View made an interesting discovery. He did some math and figured out that according to the number of faithful listeners we have, if you and every other listener gave $5, it would help Kerby and the team bring you interviews and commentary for not 3 months, but 3 years. You heard me right, .net. Or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Send $5. Urge a friend to join you. Support Point of View. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
First hour today, we spent some time talking about Islam in the Middle East. Now we're going to talk about Islam in Europe and America. New video out, Europe's Last Stand, America's Final Warning. I think we can learn quite a bit today as we bring back to the microphone an individual we've interviewed many times before, Martin Mawyer. He is the founder of the Christian Action Network, founded it back in 1990. It's an organization really created to protect America's religious and moral heritage. He has written on such issues as Silent Shame, the shocking story of child sexual abuse in America, Pathways to Success, Defending the American Family, but perhaps his most recent one, and one we've talked about with him before, Twilight in America, the untold story of Islamic terror training camps inside America. Some of you have had some questions about that. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And of course, this new video that is going to remind us of what is happening in Europe and how we need to take steps so it does not happen here in the United States. Martin, always great to have you on the program.
Thanks, Kerby. It's good to be here.
Let's, for just a minute before we get into the video, talk about those terror camps, because we, from time to time, will have people call in, and I always wish you were on the phone with us at that particular moment, asking about these camps, because it seems to me that you have broken the story. Other mainstream media occasionally cover it. There have been some people in local law enforcement that occasionally will acknowledge that, oftentimes just say, we're not even going to head into those areas because we're fearful of what might happen. But since you've broken that story, what have we found out about these terrorist camps?
Well, there's about 36 of these camps, compounds, villages, presence, scattered across the United States, and I give it in various degrees of population, because in some of the camps there's 100 or 150 members, and in some there's only 12 or a couple of families living in them as they continue to expand across the United States. So it really would depend on exactly which location we're talking about. They are headquartered in Hancock, New York, in the woods, in the mountains, and in a valley. There they have about 80 to 100 people that live in that particular compound. But they branch out from there and go all the way to Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia. They claim to have a presence in Florida. They're in Nebraska, Texas, Tennessee, California. They were in Colorado until they got booted out of there. But probably still have some presence in Colorado. They're in Michigan. So they're scattered around the United States.
Yes, and again, so most of those states that you mentioned are places where we broadcast, so pay attention to that. And we're going to actually drive people and encourage people to go to christianaction.org, which is your website. But let's talk about this new film, Europe's Last Stand, America's Final Warning. Pretty chilling, because when we talk about how there has been a desire on the part of Muslim radicals to begin to influence Europe, and how many of them are really confident that they can turn countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, others into Muslim countries very quickly, and hope eventually to turn all of Europe, including the UK, into Muslim countries. What have you found in terms of some of that basic research?
Well, thanks for asking. This film project took us 5 years from the time we began it until we actually put out the dual set DVD, which explains in 2.5 hours how Islam is making advances into Western Europe. One thing that people that say that it's not a threat immediately make an argument about is that they are a minority in Western Europe, and therefore the population numbers just don't fit the fact that they could possibly conquer Western Europe. And I just want to remind your listeners out there that for a long time and still today, the homosexual movement has been a minority population in the United States. So look at the tremendous advances they have made as a minority group. So we can dispel the fact that they're just a minority over in Western Europe. This was alerted to us right when back probably around 2009 when we were showing our film Homegrown Jihad, that the documentary version of these terrorist camps around the United States, and we were showing it in Washington, D.C. I was at a private home, and in that home were some former FBI agents. They watched the film, and then after they finished, they grouped to a corner of the room and started talking about how they felt that Europe could fall to Islam within the next 10 to 20 years. And as I listened in on their conversation, I thought, this sounds crazy. I mean, all of Western Europe being taken over by Islam, it just didn't make any sense to me. And I think if it wasn't the fact that they were former FBI agents, I probably would have dismissed it as just being outright absurd. But I went back to Lynchburg and started doing some research. And you can only do so much research, Kerby, in Lynchburg, Virginia, about what's going on in Western Europe. Most of the news items you get are in a foreign language. Most of the news broadcasts that you watch are in a foreign language, and many different foreign languages at that. And we thought the only way we're going to know the truth is actually go to Western Europe, pack our cameras, and start seeing what we can find out. And when we went to Western Europe, we went everywhere. We went to Great Britain, Sweden, the Netherlands. We went to Denmark, Brussels, Germany, France, Spain, Switzerland, Italy, just about every country in Western Europe. And while we were there, we interviewed politicians and religious leaders. Mosques. We spoke to individuals out on the street. We spoke to the experts. And at the end of 4 years of filming and many travels back and forth to Europe, we ended up with hundreds of hours of videotape and audio tape to have to sift through. And but by the time we finished, we realized that there was a rather strategic plan that Islam has for conquering Western Europe, and you can see much of that plan being implemented here at a very infant stage in the United States. And we broke that plan down to what we call the 5 pillars of Islamic conquest. And those pillars are infiltration, imams, isolation, Islamization, and then finally implosion. And by executing those 5 pillars, they're well on their way to what these FBI agents predicted and feared, that Europe could be eventually conquered by radical Islamists.
I do want to get into those 5 pillars of Islamic conquest and then talk about how they have, in some cases, no-go zones in some of these different areas. Since we're coming up to a break, let me just simply say, before we take that break, that I was amazed as I looked at some of the promo material alone, the honesty of some of these radical imams and Muslim leaders on what they wanted to accomplish, and how you have been able to get the kind of documentary work that you would hope that the mainstream media would cover, but obviously are not. And that's why I think it is so good that we have these alternative sources. And just as we go to a break, I did mention his book, Twilight in America, The Untold Story of Islamic Terrorist Training Camps Inside America. Of course, the video, which is entitled Homegrown Jihad, we've made it available, but it's also on their website. So please take the time to investigate that. And when we come back, we'll talk about those 5 pillars of Islamic conquest, because those, I think, help you understand how far along Europe is and how we need to pay attention to that here in this country. I know this last hour, some of you wanted to ask questions about Sharia law. This will be a very appropriate time to ask some of those questions. We'll get into that as well. But let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Martin Mawyer right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
Immigration is in the news these days, but not for the typical reasons. Usually we're discussing immigration reform because a bill has been filed or the Gang of Eight has decided to push legislation forward. Immigration is in the news these days for three very different reasons. Ann Coulter has a new book out with a provocative title, Adios, America. And speaking of provocative, we certainly have heard lots of comments about Donald Trump's statements in his campaign kickoff speech. And add to this the murder of Kate Steinle in the sanctuary city of San Francisco, and you have lots of people talking about immigration. Many of the facts and statistics are startling. Most Americans have a high school diploma. By contrast, about 75% of illegal aliens do not have a high school diploma. It's safe to say that many of the Mexicans coming to America are not achievers in the educational or economic sense. Of greater concern is the number of illegal aliens in prison. And Coulter reminds us that the federal government refuses to tell us how many prisoners are immigrants. What we do know is concerning. For example, there are more foreign inmates in the New York State prisons from Mexico than from the entire continent of Europe. This is significant since half of all Mexican immigrants in the United States live either in Texas or California. One estimate is that 71% of non-American citizens in federal prisons are from Mexico. Another government statistic shows that Mexican criminals represent 16% of all convicts serving time in federal penitentiaries. You know, President Reagan signed the Immigration Reform Act in 1986. President Bill Clinton signed another immigration reform bill in 1996. Nearly 20 years later, we still have a problem, in part because the mayor of San Francisco and the Obama administration will not obey the immigration laws on the books. We need this debate if for no other reason than the fact that important facts are starting to surface about our immigration chaos. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back with Martin Mawyer, and if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talking about this new film, Europe's Last Stand, America's Final Warning. And I might encourage you to get something to write with, because we're going to talk for just a few minutes about the 5 pillars of Islamic conquest. Martin, let's get to the first one, infiltration. What does that entail?
Well, for Western Europe, this involves literally millions of Muslims coming into Western Europe from all over the globe. But most of your listeners probably are more familiar with those arriving in Italy through the Mediterranean Sea. And in this case, you have rather poor Muslims who are hopping onto rather rickety boats in Libya and Ethiopia to travel the Mediterranean Sea to land on an island called Lampedusa. And it's a very dangerous journey. The boats are not seaworthy. More by a teenage boy who's only doing it because that's the way that he's going to pay his way to get to Western Europe. And then when they arrive on this small island of Lampedusa, they're then transferred to Italy, where they're put in holding centers. But they're not really there to stay in Italy. What they want to do is to then move on the trains up into the rest of Western Europe and unite with other family members that they have. This is a big migrant route for Muslims coming into Western Europe, but it's not the sole route. Many of them come through Athens, Greece, and it's controlled by organized crime. Organized crime makes billions of dollars off of these Muslim refugees and taking them into Western Europe. So immediately you have a rather large influx of Muslims coming into Western Europe, whether it's through illegal immigration or legal immigration or through refugee assistance programs or through family reunification programs. But to say the least, there are more and more Muslims that are populating Western Europe. But just being there doesn't really do anything as far as conquering Western Europe. For that, they need what's called imams. Now, these are the spiritual leaders of the mosque that are scattered throughout Western Europe. And these are radical imams who have the sole purpose of wanting to conquer Western Europe. And they preach this to the new arrivals that are coming in, that this is their goal. And in our documentary, you can see, as you mentioned before going to commercial break, these imams are rather upfront. They're not trying to hide it. They are saying that is their goal, is to conquer Western Europe. But to get all of these individuals into the same playing field, they need to have areas where they control these Muslims. This is where you get into the isolation area, which is the third pillar, to become isolated. We've all heard of European no-go zones. This is what I'm referring to by the isolated communities in Western Europe, where if you're not a Muslim, it's best that you stay out of these areas because they're being trained to conquer Western Europe in those zones and to preach Sharia law to these Muslim migrants that are arriving. But now that you have a bunch of Muslims that are in isolated areas and so-called no-go zones, they then need something else for the non-believers, and that's what we call the fourth pillar of radical Islam, Islamization. That is, it's not just enough for the Muslims themselves to abide by Sharia law. They want the non-Muslim European community to also abide by Sharia law. And you've seen Sharia patrol units being set up in Western Europe where Muslims go out into areas of non-Muslim places, and they begin to enforce Sharia law. And that is no drinking, no smoking. Go after the shops that will sell alcohol. Go after the shops that will sell pork products. Go to the shops and make sure that there's areas where a woman can come in, a man can come in. This has been some very controversial activity that's been going on in Western Europe. In one British town, the local police force actually asked their female officers to dress up in full burqas for that day, just so they can show they have a relationship with the Muslim community. But now that you have Islamization programs going on in Western Europe, you also need to be able to take advantage of what I call the imploding nature of Western Europe, called implosion, the fifth pillar. Implosion is basically self-inflicted. It's when a country decides that it no longer wants to remember its values, its traditions, its patriotic heritage, when all it can do is find wrong in itself. And when that happens, you're actually embodying another enemy to come in and then take control of your people. And that's what's happening in Western Europe. That's a very quick 2.5 hours documentary given to you in a few minutes.
Well, I think you did a very good job. And again, for those of you taking notes, that first one, again, is infiltration. And this is, I think, very important because, again, this is bringing in millions of Muslims. Now, of course, you heard in the first hour, even the possibility of many of them will come to this country eventually. Then, of course, the imams, who are the radical nature of that. And, of course, as you look in this country, you can see that as individuals have been able to sneak into some of the mosques, they've seen that some of these Friday messages are quite radical. Then, of course, isolation. We don't have too many of those no-go zones, but there's a few places where it would be a little tough for you to go. Maybe in Dearborn, Michigan, it's not quite like what we see in Europe, which is quite significant. Then, of course, Islamization, that is the attempt to get the country to abide by Sharia law. And then finally, implosion, the impact of that such things as multiculturalism, political correctness, and much, much more having. There is obviously a parallel, and that's one of the reasons, Martin, you say that we are not just talking about the last stand in Europe, but this is really, in a sense, the final warning to America as well, because as I went through your 5 points, we see some of that even here in the United States, don't we?
Yeah, well, you certainly see infiltration because you see the Obama administration that's been bringing in thousands and thousands of Somalis who are basically radical in nature when they get to the United States. You got very large Somali populations in Minnesota, in Nashville, Tennessee, in Lewistown, Maine, and Columbus, Ohio. And now they want to bring Somalis into Spartanburg, South Carolina, and other places. And these people, what happens is once they get a community together and they do not speak English, you have the radical imams that then becomes their leader to direct them and how to expand outward and push for their Sharia goal ideas. And you can see that in the United States happening. You know, one of the big parts of Sharia law is not to criticize Islam. We all know that. If you insult the Prophet Muhammad or you do something to the Quran. And we see that also happening here in the United States, that type of Sharia law. Our organization a couple of years ago was fined by the state of Maine $4,000 because they said we sent out a letter that offended Muslims. And, in fact, we did not send out a letter that offended Muslims. We simply sent out a letter that said in a California school they have a teaching program there that is asking non-Muslim kids to dress up as Muslims and adopt a Muslim name and learn the 5 pillars of the Islamic faith. Well, the state of Maine thought that was offensive to Muslims for some reason and fined us $4,000. Then we wrote a book about the terrorist camps in the United States, and we were sued for $55 million for doing so. This is all part of Sharia law, that you can't talk about Islam. So you look around the United States and you can see implementation of this in many different communities, and it's growing, and it's becoming rather fearful.
Let's, if we can, take a break. But when we come back, I want to ask a question and then also give our callers a chance to ask some questions. But one that I'm sure is on the minds of some is as we go through these 5 pillars of Islamic conquest, infiltration, imams, isolation, Islamization, as well as implosion, there's one that seems to be missing, and that is terrorism. And I think it illustrates, again, 2 different kind of mindsets in terms of one, which would be a violent terrorist jihad, and the other would be a cultural jihad. So I certainly want to have you address that, but we do need to take a break. And as we are taking a break, let me encourage you to do a couple of things. First of all, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. As you've heard us talking about these terrorist camps, if you've heard us talking about some of these enclaves that exist, some of which are actually just simply trying to establish maybe what eventually could be a no-go zone, you perhaps are in one of those states where we've been talking about it, so perhaps you have a comment or a question about that. Of course, the question of Sharia law and whether or not we are seeing Sharia-compliant companies is certainly irrelevant, and whether or not we're going to be using Sharia law interpretation, those are certainly relevant questions. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. As we go to the break, let me also mention that you can go and find the links that we have provided today, including a very nice trailer, which I would encourage you to watch. That will give you a chance to know a little bit more about this particular film, Europe's Last Stand, America's Final Warning. And, of course, we have a link to christianaction.org. Let's take a break. 1-800-351-1212. We'll take your calls and continue our conversation right after this.
There is a big incentive to pay your electric bill. If you don't, you find yourself in the dark. But who pays to make sure you're educated on the key issues of the day, to bring you wisdom for life at work, at home, and in the culture, like you hear from guests here on Point of View? Who makes sure that our electric bill gets paid? You're way ahead of me, aren't you? That's right. You do. The truth is, if every listener this week gave just $5, we could pay our bills for about the next 3 years. Did you hear me? $5, 3 years. Now, perhaps you can give more. How about $50 or $500, maybe even more? But please, don't be the one who fails to send at least $5. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Whatever amount you chip in, thank you for your gift. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Martin Mawyer, and if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212, talking about his new film, Europe's Last Stand, America's Final Warning. And just before we do take some phone calls, Martin, let's, if we can, come back to that question. When we look at the 5 pillars of Islamic conquest, whether it's infiltration or imams or isolation or Islamization or implosion, one seems to be missing. And that is, I think a lot of our listeners would have said, where's terrorism fit in all of that? And there are really two different kind of strategies in terms of trying to bring about the future Islamization of the world. One is to follow a radical, violent, dangerous type, and ISIS and even maybe the Muslim Brotherhood and Hezbollah and Hamas fit into that category. But there's another kind of mindset, and more you're seeing the Muslim Brotherhood and many of these other Muslim groups that really have more of a cultural jihad. That is, we will use peaceable means to bring about the Islamic domination of various countries. Am I correct?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are two prevailing, perhaps, paths to try to conquer a country or a nation. One is through what has been, I think, rightly described as stealth jihad, and that's what we see mostly what's going on in Western Europe and in the United States. And then you have the other, which is to try to terrorize us into submission. These two parties basically operate independently of each other, and it wasn't included in ours because terrorism isn't the thing that's going to bring these countries down. Terrorism typically unites people, and it reminds them of their patriotic past. And you are killing family members, and it actually strengthens our will to resist. Whereas a drip of a water spigot that slowly and surely rights and land starts to disappear in front of your face, and before you know it, there's a new king in town. And I think that is much more dangerous than the terrorist acts of some of the Muslims. It worries me less. But I will say this, the people who are involved with stealth jihad do not mind the terrorist acts that happen, even though they claim they have nothing to do with it or they have no knowledge of it and that they disapprove of it. Because when a terrorist act happens, then these stealth jihadis in these countries will go to the government and say, look, I can tell you what's going on. It's because of your presence here or your dictatorial process here, or you're not allowing us to do this there, is the reason why you're getting bombed and you're getting attacked. So if you just give in and allow us to, again, Islamize your country a bit, I'm sure these terrorists will stop bombing you and knifing you and shooting you and killing you. So they do use it to their advantage. But it really isn't one of the pillars of conquest that the stealth jihadis have up their sleeves, but they will use it to their advantage.
Let's take some phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. We'll head first to South Carolina, WLPG. Leroy, thank you for calling today.
Well, thank you for taking the call. Anyhow, I've been a 40-year-old Christian, and, in Hebrews it says it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God, and I've been there and done that, and terrorists don't have no terror from me after that experience. But anyhow, I wanted to ask about the Jones preacher. I'm a Jones, and one time he was going to burn some Quran books down in Florida, and then I think the politician got in there and got him not to burn them. But anyhow, I was wondering what happened.
Sure.
After that.
Yeah, well, his name is Terry Jones, and he was kind of a pastor of a church, but kind of got crossways with the church. The last time I think I heard he was running a restaurant, but that was in a kind of a national issue at that time, Martin, and I think it's illustrative of the fact that sometimes those actions are used by those who believe in a cultural jihad or a stealth jihad to once again say, see, there's just a lot of Islamophobia out here. Here's this one pastor, again, one pastor out of 300 plus million people that want to burn the Quran. But they use those as a way to advance their kind of agenda, don't they?
Well, I know you didn't bring me on to talk strategy about how to fight back, but I just do not think that the Terry Jones method of burning Korans and I'll say this, the Pamela Geller method of having events where you depict Muhammad as a monster is an effective method of striking back at what these stealth jihadists or the radical or the very dangerous jihadists are trying to do to us. I don't see the value of it. I don't see what that gets us. And I think it makes it more difficult for the rest of us who are legitimately trying to fight back. And I'll give you an example. You know, our film was out, and it's been out since Pamela Geller did her Draw Muhammad Day thing. And previously, we had a number of venues lined up that wanted to show our film. But after that event, and a couple of Muslims came there to do some damage, and it threatened the people. And now churches and other venues are afraid to even show our film, which, if you've seen any of it, you know it will not rile the feathers of Muslims. As a matter of fact, they'll probably cheer that I'm exposing their plan, but it will alert Americans about what that plan is. I just don't know what it accomplishes to get into the face and just degrade and insult Islam or the Muslim people in this fashion.
Well, and I think you have to recognize that there are a fair number of individuals that came to America because they wanted to get away from what they felt was the dominance of Islam in their lives. And so then to make them feel like they now have to defend something they really don't want to defend, or we'll go to Georgia this time, WLPE, and this caller would like to remain anonymous. You can go ahead. You are on with Martin Mawyer.
I would really like to hear you address the Muslim movement in the jails and the prisons. I know that they are making a lot of giving in to the dietary laws and the wearing of the little hats, and I would just really like to hear your comment on that.
You know, we sat down with someone who was in prison for a number of years and spoke to that individual about Islam and the prisons that he was in. When he was in some prisons in the South Georgia and Florida, and some other ones, and as he was transferred from here to there. And he spoke to us about Islam in prison and how it's growing and why it's growing. But look, you know, prison is a different world, and a lot of us have no idea what really goes on behind those bars and those walls, but it's a select community of individuals who need protection when they're in there. And so groups are formed, whether they're Mexican gang groups or other types of gangs. Well, Islam is sort of a gang group inside of prison. But it's more than just a gang group like the others, because they demand special privileges of when they work and what they eat and what they can wear and how they're treated. So it has a tendency to become attractive to people who would never even think about becoming Muslim because of the special treatment that they get while they are in prison and the protection that it provides. But one of the more disturbing things that we were told are the amount of radical jihadist type of material that is not only brought into the prisons, but is taught inside of the prisons in front of guards. And the reason why they can do that is because many of these people will speak in a foreign language, and the guards don't understand the language. So they can actually radicalize new people inside of those prisons if they speak the same language. And there are a lot of foreigners in these prisons who speak languages our American-speaking guards cannot understand. But also, there's plenty of cases where these classes go on in prisons that are just basically unmonitored by guards at all. And he explained to us how they would set the Muslim guards outside of the teaching room doors, just in case a real guard would walk by, they could take down what they have on the chalkboard. They can cover up the material, the radical material that they're preaching from, and then when the guard gets there, all is good. They're being trained, he said, to send them out into the communities afterwards to perform radical, very dangerous Islamic activity. So in our prisons, it's a very nasty deal. And you can see that also going on in the prisons in Western Europe, where so many of the inmates now in European prisons are of the Islamic faith. It's just astounding in Western Europe, the increase of Muslims inside of the prisons there.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue taking some phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. The film, again, Europe's Last Stand, America's Final Warning. We'll talk more about that with you right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talking today for just a few more minutes with Martin Mawyer as we talk about Europe's Last Stand, America's Final Warning. We'll go to Texas this time. Tom, listening on KBJS. What's your question for us today?
How you doing? Thank you for your show. I appreciate you. I was just curious. I had read, and I don't know if I didn't research it, about isn't Islam a predominantly governmental system?
Certainly in the Middle East it is. It's you know, we kind of in this country, I would say, Martin, have this idea of a separation of church and state. But if you go to many of these countries, there's no separation of mosque and state because it becomes kind of theocratic, wouldn't you say? Especially when we look at places like, as we did in the first hour, Iran. But what about that?
Well, that's the difference between Muslim and Islam. Muslim is a follower of the Quran, and Islam is the political system that governs Islam. And Islam itself, as Ajam Chowdhury so aptly stated in our documentary, is an entire political system. It governs every part of your life. It governs the government. It governs the laws. It governs your eating habits, your prayer times, your relationships, how you raise your kids, how you go to the bathroom. Islam governs everything, not just your spiritual life. So the caller is correct, Tom. There is a big difference between saying I'm a Muslim, but for someone always raises red flags to me when someone says I'm Islamic, because I know exactly what he's referring to rather than that person saying he's a Muslim.
Well, that's a good point. Tom, any follow-up?
Yeah, okay. So if being Islamic is a form of government, then why do we have to tolerate it in this country?
Well, okay, that's a good question. It kind of gets us into some of the question about what's happening here in America, because there are certain inroads being made in our governmental system with Sharia law sometimes used in the civil code, and Sharia-compliant corporations, and deference given to students in Ramadan, and those kinds of things. So what about that, Martin? Because I know you've been thinking about that as well.
Sure. There's probably a lot of explanations for that, but the one I think that dominates is that our political leaders have bought into a strategy, and that strategy is if we appease Muslims, if we appease Islam, then they will eventually like us and tolerate us back and allow us to live our lives. So what we need to do is to give in a piece here, a piece there, stop offending them. In other words, it's all our fault. And if you're trying to win a battle when you're pointing the finger back at yourself saying, I'm the one to blame, it's not much of an offense, and it's not a battle that you're going to win and you're going to lose. And Europe is an example of that. They constantly point their fingers at themselves. But at least they have a bit more reason, even though I don't think it's legit, but a bit more reason than America, because Europe saw Hitler. And Hitler still dominates the mindsets of the individuals in Western Europe. That's why they're afraid to say anything bad about anybody else. And why, if you sit down even in a pub over there and ask someone about Islam, they'll look at you as if you just uttered a Nazi saying, because you just do not talk about it. It's forbidden over there. If you do say too much about it, you're liable to go to jail, you're liable to get fired, and you're liable to get fined. That's the primary reason in Western Europe why there's an inability to fight back, because you can't say anything bad about Islam. And I see that coming here to the United States as well.
Let's, if we can, give people some action items. And the first one is, of course, we've posted your trailer. It's less than 3 minutes long. I would encourage every listener to watch it. Then you got the share button there. You can put it on your Facebook page and start some conversation. So certainly that would be one very important step. The other is I would like to have you talk for just a minute about the film, how people can order it, whether or not you could show it in your church, because you talked about some of those church showings began to decline. But Martin, for a few minutes, we have a lot of activists here, so give them their marching orders. What would you like them to do?
Well, I would like for people to get onto our website and sign up for our newsletter. That way we can stay in contact with them and they can stay in contact with us and give us ideas if they want to host a showing of the film in their church, even a 38-minute promo showing, which doesn't take long at all to watch. That would be great for getting this message out. I think the number one thing Christians have to do is we got to stand up and say enough is enough, though. We can't continue to back down from our beliefs and our way of life and cave in at every possible threat that we're getting, whether it's from the liberal left or secularists or from the Islamists. And until Christians can take that stand and live a life that God intended them to lead and feel free in this country to do so, I think we're going to continue to lose these battles. In Western Europe, they have lost that battle because they will not take a stand. No one, very few people over there are willing to take that stand. I won't say no one, but if you watch the fifth pillar in our documentary, you will see exactly what happens to individuals who dare to stand up against Islam. It's the most fascinating part of our documentary. Unfortunately, it's at the end. But if you make it to the end, you're going to be astounded by what you see there. But in the United States, we still have the ability to stand up. In Europe, They don't have the advantages we have here. They don't have the churches we have here. They don't have the television, the radio programs that we have here. They don't have the radio programs that we have here. We have a lot of tools at our disposal still if we choose to use them. And I encourage us all to use them if you really want to stand up and not be defeated as they're being defeated in Western Europe.
And again, people can contact you, as you said, if they wanted to have a showing. We've had some people off air saying, well, can you be more specific about where those particular terrorist training camps are? Well, they can contact you, or they can, of course, watch the video Homegrown Jihad, or even get your book Twilight in America. So there are some ways in which we need to be sort of the eyes and ears when we see things that don't seem right. Those are certainly ways in which we can pay attention to the terrorist part of that jihad. And then we all need to be paying attention to the stealth or cultural jihad, in which we talked about those 5 pillars of Islamic conquest. So again, I think you've done a very good job of educating us, and hopefully these resources will empower our people to go out and make a difference. So Martin, appreciate the fact that you were willing to spend so much time, energy, and money over in Europe to see what is happening there. And it's a real warning to us here in the United States, isn't it?
Well, Kerby, I just so appreciate you having me on the air and giving me an opportunity to talk to your listeners. That's what this is all about. That's why we did the film. And there's no sense having it sit on a shelf somewhere. We need to get in the hands of the churches and the political leaders and grassroots activists out there who want to learn more about this issue.
Again, ChristianAction.org. Of course, we have a link there. We have the trailer up there so that you can watch that, pass it on to your friends and neighbors. And, of course, we have all the information about Martin and his organization there as well. So thank you for joining us. Just before we run out of time, let me mention again that that's why we do the programs that we do here, to really educate you. And over these last 2 hours, we've talked about Islam over in the Middle East. We've talked about Islam in Europe, and even Islam here in America. And it's important for us to think through these issues. Very importantly, we really want to educate you and empower you so that you can be equipped to go out and make a difference. And so that's a lot of what we are all about here at Point of View. And so take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. You can find out a little bit more about some of the books we've mentioned, about the videos that we have certainly talked about, and I would encourage you to take that material, use it effectively in your own community. Just before we run out of time, I want to thank Abby and Andrew for their help behind the scenes, Catherine and Chris as well for their help. Visit the website, pointofview.net. You will see all sorts of viewpoint commentaries as well as action items. And just as we go, we are encouraging you, if perhaps you might even share $5 with us. That's a way of saying thank you for the information that you've heard today here on Point of View. It's all available at the website, pointofview.net. We'll be back here tomorrow with you. We'll see you then.
What does a hero look like? I remember a woman stricken with MS. She was in a wheelchair, and every week after church, people would get down on a knee and greet her and pray for her. But do you know what caught my eye? The seemingly invisible man behind the wheelchair, silently caring for his beloved, sacrificing for her. In the Bible, Jesus talked about a big giver who had a marching band come with him as he dumped his treasure in the temple coffers. But Jesus saw a woman who gave a tiny gift that was actually huge. If you appreciate Point of View but can't give $30 or $65 or more, well, get this. If every listener gave $5, it would pay our bills for the next 3 years. 3 years. Give $5 today. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Thank you for being our hero.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.